What happens when a billionaire is kicked off a flight by a flight attendant who doesn't know who he is? What if that decision comes back to haunt her in a way no one could have predicted? Stick around, because this story takes a twist you won't see coming. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Jordan Maxwell had always believed in handling things with calmness and grace. A successful billionaire known for his ventures in various industries, he was accustomed to traveling in luxury and comfort. His private jet was something he cherished, but occasionally he still flew commercial for the experience, just to see how the world outside of his bubble lived. That day, he was on a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles, a first-class seat booked in advance, and everything was set for a quiet journey. Little did he know this flight would be far from peaceful. As he walked down the aisle toward his seat, he noticed a bit of a commotion in the first-class section. A flight attendant, a young woman with a stern expression, was talking to another passenger who appeared to be in the wrong seat. The woman's tone was firm, but not hostile. Yet, there was something in the way she carried herself that didn't sit right with Jordan. As he reached his row, he stood still for a moment, watching the situation unfold, but then turned his attention to his own seat. It was in the middle of the row, near the window, just where he liked it. He put his bag in the overhead compartment and sat down, expecting the flight to take off smoothly. But just as he was settling in, the flight attendant approached him with a small clipboard in hand. She smiled, but there was an edge to it. "Excuse me, sir," she began. "I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat. We've had a mix-up with the reservations." Jordan, who always kept a copy of his reservation on his phone, didn't even blink. "I think there's been a mistake," he replied, showing her the confirmation number and pointing to the seat he was in. "This is the seat I booked." The flight attendant looked at the details and then back at him. She hesitated for a moment, her smile faltering slightly. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's a passenger who's supposed to be sitting here. We'll need you to move." Jordan could feel the tension in the air rise. He had never liked confrontation, but he wasn't one to back down, especially when he knew he was in the right. "I'm not moving. This is my seat and I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a moment, as if considering her options. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked to the front of the plane, clearly to speak with her supervisor. Jordan watched as she disappeared into the cabin, shaking his head. This wasn't a situation he had ever expected to be in. There were plenty of things he had grown used to, the luxury, the respect, the comfort. But this was different. A few moments later, the supervisor appeared at Jordan's side. The man, an older gentleman, was trying to remain calm, but it was clear he wasn't happy about having to deal with the issue. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion," the supervisor said, his voice polite but firm. "You'll need to move. There's someone who has a reservation for this seat." Jordan, still calm but growing frustrated, looked the supervisor in the eye. "I've already shown you the reservation. This is my seat." The supervisor glanced over at the flight attendant, who nodded her head subtly. Then, without further explanation, the supervisor said, "I'm sorry, sir, but you'll need to vacate the seat. We don't want to delay the flight." Jordan's patience was wearing thin, but he didn't want to make a scene. So, reluctantly, he stood up, grabbed his bag, and moved to the back of the plane. As he passed the first-class passengers, he could feel their eyes on him. Some looked at him sympathetically, while others seemed to avoid making eye contact, perhaps not knowing who he was. He didn't mind. In his mind, it was all just a momentary inconvenience. But as Jordan settled into a less comfortable seat in the back, a small smirk spread across the flight attendant's face as she walked past. He caught a glimpse of it, a smile that seemed almost too smug for someone who had just caused a disturbance. It was in that moment that something inside him clicked. He wasn't someone who let these kinds of things slide. And though he'd tried to let it go, Jordan Maxwell wasn't the type to be humiliated without making sure it didn't happen again. He leaned back in his seat, staring out the window, the hum of the engines barely registering. This was far from over. Jordan sat in the back of the plane, trying to shake off the frustration that was bubbling inside him. The seat wasn't nearly as comfortable as the one he had originally chosen, and he could feel the weight of the injustice pressing on him. But more than that, what irritated him most was the way the flight attendant had treated him. There was something dismissive in her manner, as if he was just another ordinary passenger who could be pushed around. That was a mistake she would soon regret. He glanced around at the other passengers, most of whom were absorbed in their own worlds, either reading, sleeping, or staring blankly at their screens. No one seemed to notice the tension in the air. The flight attendant, now back at her station, was busy chatting with another crew member. Jordan's mind started working through the situation, calculating what his next move would be. He wasn't a man who liked to feel powerless, and this situation was no exception. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how simple the solution was. Just 10 minutes into the flight, Jordan pulled out his phone and started making a few calls. He didn't need to raise his voice, and he didn't need to be aggressive. A quick, silent exchange of messages, followed by a couple of calls to people who owed him favors, was all it took. By the time the flight attendant started serving the first round of drinks, the first signs of chaos began to unfold. Passengers began to notice small irregularities. The temperature in the cabin suddenly became too hot, and the air conditioning seemed to malfunction, causing some passengers to fan themselves, while others complained to the flight attendants. The drinks cart, which should have been moving quickly down the aisle, was delayed by several minutes. A few passengers started grumbling under their breath, wondering why things were taking so long. The flight attendants, caught off guard by the sudden shift in atmosphere, started scrambling. They couldn't figure out what was going wrong. The temperature controls were working perfectly, yet the cabin was uncomfortably warm. The food and drinks, which were supposed to be ready for service, were now delayed with no clear explanation. The tension in the air was rising, but none of the crew could pinpoint the cause of the disruptions. Meanwhile, Jordan remained calm, watching it all unfold, his face a picture of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't long before the captain received an urgent message from the airline's corporate office. The airline had just been notified about the delay in services, and the message had one clear instruction: resolve the situation quickly or face serious repercussions. The crew, now visibly flustered, couldn't understand what was going on, but they followed the order without question. The flight attendant who had earlier kicked Jordan out of his seat was particularly rattled. She started moving quickly down the aisle, checking in with the passengers, trying to smooth things over. But as she passed by Jordan, he could see the look of confusion on her face. She had no idea what was happening. Jordan, however, did. With a quiet smile, he leaned back in his seat, making sure she caught a glimpse of him. He had set everything in motion, and now the consequences were beginning to unfold. A few moments later, the head flight attendant approached, her face tense, as if expecting the worst. She pulled the young flight attendant aside and started speaking in low tones. Jordan could hear the words corporate office and audit being mentioned. The tension in the air grew thicker. The flight attendant's smug smile from earlier was long gone, replaced by a nervous expression. Jordan knew what was happening. His phone calls had already set things in motion. The airline's higher-ups were now involved, and they weren't pleased with how things had been handled. It was no longer just about a seat on a plane. This was about a billion-dollar empire, and Jordan Maxwell was no ordinary passenger. He'd made sure that the people who ran this airline would remember his name. He sat back, knowing the flight would be a lot less comfortable for the staff than it would be for him. As the flight continued its steady course through the sky, the flight attendants were on edge. The initial confusion had barely started to settle, but the ripple effect of Jordan's subtle interference was still unfolding. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. There was now a noticeable unease among the crew. The flight attendants kept glancing nervously at one another, unsure of what exactly was happening, but instinctively feeling that things were not going according to plan. Jordan, on the other hand, remained completely at ease. His calm demeanor never faltered as he sat in his less-than-ideal seat, watching the situation unfold. From the window, he could see nothing but the endless stretch of clouds below them. It was a quiet, almost serene view, but Jordan knew it wouldn't be for long. The chain of events he had set in motion was only beginning to affect the crew. As the flight attendant who had initially asked him to move walked past him again, Jordan could see the stress in her face. She was no longer the confident, smug figure from earlier. Now she seemed jittery, almost panicked. She shot him a quick, uncertain glance before hurrying to the front of the plane. Jordan's eyes followed her every move, enjoying the subtle chaos that was slowly unraveling around her. Minutes passed, but the disruption continued. The temperature in the cabin fluctuated erratically, cooling down suddenly before spiking again. Passengers began to murmur, fanning themselves or complaining. Some even raised their voices to the crew, asking why things were taking so long. The flight attendants scrambled to control the situation, but it was clear they were losing control of the cabin. They started making excuses, but the passengers weren't having it. A couple of people were even on the verge of making formal complaints. It wasn't just the temperature or the delays with the drinks. The announcements over the PA system had become increasingly delayed, and the snacks were nowhere to be found. What should have been a smooth and routine flight was turning into a minor disaster. Jordan could sense the mounting pressure from the crew as they became increasingly aware that something was wrong, but couldn't figure out what. They had no idea that they were the ones causing the issue by not addressing it properly. And, of course, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Jordan glanced over at the head flight attendant, who was whispering urgently into her headset. Her face had grown pale, and she looked as though she was trying to manage a situation far beyond her control. Her hands trembled slightly as she relayed information to the captain, who was no doubt growing frustrated as well. It was clear the flight wasn't going according to schedule, and the airline's higher-ups were starting to feel the heat. Jordan's eyes never left her as she moved down the aisle, now more frantic than ever. Finally, Jordan picked up his phone again. He knew he had to keep the pressure on. He wasn't just enjoying the chaos for its own sake. He was teaching them a lesson. As he made a couple more quiet calls, things began to escalate further. The captain was forced to make an unexpected announcement over the intercom, informing passengers that there would be a short delay in service due to technical difficulties. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder as confusion spread through the cabin. Some exchanged glances, others sighed in frustration. All of a sudden, the head flight attendant appeared in the aisle again, walking directly toward Jordan. She was no longer walking with the brisk, businesslike stride of someone in control. Now she was walking slowly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure how to approach him. Jordan watched her approach, savoring the moment. She had no idea what was about to hit her. "Mr. Maxwell," she said, trying to sound calm but failing to mask the nervousness in her voice. There seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience earlier, but..." Jordan interrupted her with a polite but firm tone. "I believe it's more than a misunderstanding," he said coolly. "It's a lesson in how to treat your passengers, and I'm afraid it's not going to be one you'll soon forget." She looked startled by his response, her eyes wide, but before she could speak, Jordan continued. "You see, I own several luxury airlines. I don't take well to being humiliated in front of others, especially in a situation like this. But when you treat someone like they're disposable, it's only a matter of time before that comes back to bite you." The flight attendant's face drained of color as she realized exactly who she was dealing with. The pieces clicked into place. The name Maxwell had been mentioned quietly in the crew room earlier, but she hadn't connected the dots until now. Jordan Maxwell, the billionaire investor, the man with influence in the airline industry, the one who could make or break careers with a single phone call. Her apology faltered. I didn't realize. Sir, I'm so sorry. I never meant." Jordan cut her off. "I'm sure you didn't. But the fact remains that I'm not some ordinary passenger you can push around. You'll need to get your priorities straight." He let the words sink in as the flight attendant stood there, speechless. The humiliation she had tried to inflict on him had turned into a lesson she would never forget. Jordan leaned back in his seat, a slight smile on his lips, knowing that he had only just begun to make his point. The flight would be a long one for her, but for him, it was already over. As the minutes passed, Jordan could see the shift happening in real time. The flight attendant, once so confident and smug, was now visibly flustered, her hands shaking as she moved up and down the aisles, trying to keep up with the chaos she had unwittingly sparked. The other crew members, too, were feeling the pressure. They had started noticing that nothing was going as planned, but they were too caught up in their scrambling to figure out why. Meanwhile, Jordan remained perfectly calm. He didn't let his frustration show. After all, he was used to situations like this. But he knew that it wasn't just about the seat or the petty humiliation. It was about respect. It was about showing that people couldn't simply treat him like a problem to be solved. He was Jordan Maxwell, and in his world, people didn't get to push him around without consequences. It wasn't long before the flight attendant returned, this time accompanied by the head flight attendant, who seemed to have recovered some of her composure, but was still trying to mask the growing anxiety in her eyes. She approached Jordan's seat slowly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure how to handle the situation. Her demeanor had completely shifted from authoritative to apologetic, and the air of arrogance she once carried was gone. Now, she looked every bit the part of someone who had made a grave mistake. "Mr. Maxwell," the head flight attendant began, her voice much softer now. "I just spoke with the corporate office. They've been made aware of the situation, and I've been told to personally apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced today." Her words were polite, but Jordan could tell they were rehearsed and not heartfelt. Still, he listened patiently. "You see, we've had some issues with the flight today, but I want to assure you that this won't happen again. We value all of our passengers, and I can promise you that this situation will be addressed accordingly." She paused, and for a moment, Jordan wondered if she even knew who she was talking to. He tilted his head slightly, letting her stew in her uncertainty for a few seconds. "Addressed accordingly?" he repeated calmly, his voice carrying a subtle weight. "I think you've done more than enough already, don't you?" She glanced over at the young flight attendant who had originally kicked Jordan out of his seat. The younger woman looked mortified, her eyes darting around, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Jordan could tell she was rattled, her earlier confidence replaced with something closer to dread. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience for them anymore. It was beginning to feel like an impending disaster. "You don't seem to understand," Jordan continued, his tone low but firm. "When you treat someone poorly, it doesn't just disappear with an apology. It's not about the seat. It's about how you made me feel like I was nothing, how you made me feel like I had no right to be where I was." He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the flight attendant. "I don't forget these things, and neither should you." The head flight attendant's face reddened, and Jordan could see the tension in her body language. She had expected a simple apology to resolve the matter, but it was clear that she was losing control of the situation. "I understand, Mr. Maxwell, and I deeply apologize for the inconvenience, but please know, this will not happen again," she said, still trying to maintain professionalism. Her voice wavered, betraying her discomfort. Jordan leaned back in his seat, satisfied with the discomfort he had caused. He didn't need to raise his voice or make any threats. His mere presence, his calm and calculated demeanor, was enough to unnerve them both. But he knew that was only part of the equation. The real lesson wasn't going to come from an apology. It was going to come from the consequences of their actions. "You're right," Jordan said, his voice now softer but carrying an undeniable authority. "It won't happen again. But I think we both know that what happens next isn't something you'll forget quickly. And that's a promise." The head flight attendant, sensing that there was nothing more to be said, nodded quietly and turned to leave. The younger flight attendant hesitated for a moment, looking at Jordan with wide, uncertain eyes. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but thought better of it. Instead, she hurried after her superior, disappearing into the front of the plane. Jordan watched them go, knowing this wasn't over yet. He had made his point, but he wasn't done. The power dynamics had shifted, and he was in control now. As the minutes ticked by, Jordan knew that the ripple effects of this encounter were only beginning to unfold. The flight attendants might have thought they were in charge, but they were about to learn just how quickly the tables could turn when you underestimated someone who had the means to make things right, on his terms. He settled back into his seat once more, feeling the slight bump of the plane as it cruised through the sky. The storm in the cabin had passed, but Jordan's mind was already moving ahead, thinking about how he would ensure this didn't go unpunished. He wasn't just looking for an apology, he was looking for a lesson that no one would forget, and the consequences of that lesson were about to come crashing down on them all. As the flight continued, the cabin slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The temperature seemed to stabilize, and the minor delays with the service were quickly forgotten as the passengers resumed their usual activities. The flight attendants, however, were still feeling the effects of what had happened. They could no longer act as if everything was normal. Their eyes darted nervously around the cabin, glancing at one another as if expecting more problems. But the real problem wasn't about the temperature or the service, it was about Jordan Maxwell. He could see the flight attendants trying to keep their composure, but it was obvious they were on edge. The head flight attendant had made one last effort to salvage the situation, but Jordan had already made it clear that an apology wouldn't cut it. He wasn't the kind of man who would let something like this slide, not after the way they'd treated him. And now he was just waiting for the right moment to deliver the final blow. The plane was a few hours into the flight when the announcement came over the intercom. It was from the captain, but it wasn't the usual friendly update passengers were used to hearing. This time the voice was different, more strained. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the unexpected delays in service. Unfortunately, we are experiencing some technical issues that are taking longer than expected to resolve. Please bear with us as we work to address the situation. We will keep you updated. Jordan couldn't help but smirk. The captain's announcement wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of the ongoing fallout from the situation he had caused. He had made sure that those in charge of the airline would feel the ripple effects of the flight's disruption. The corporate offices were now aware of the issue, and they were demanding an explanation. As the minutes passed, Jordan could sense the building pressure among the flight attendants. They had gone from being dismissive to apologetic, but now they were fighting to keep the situation under control. The problem, however, was bigger than any of them realized. The airline's executives had been informed of the incident, and Jordan's influence was not to be underestimated. While the crew scrambled to handle the inconvenienced passengers, they had no idea that their mistake was about to cost them more than just their pride. Jordan knew that the flight attendants had no idea who they were truly dealing with. To them, he was just another wealthy passenger, a man with a high-status ticket and a lot of money. But he was more than that. He wasn't just a passenger. He had the power to shape the entire airline's fate. He leaned back in his seat and made another call. This time it wasn't just a casual phone call. This one would hit harder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The people on the other end of the line already knew what to do. A quiet exchange of words, and then he hung up, knowing that the last piece of the puzzle was now in motion. A few minutes later, the head flight attendant returned to the cabin, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly. She stopped by Jordan's seat, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Maxwell," she said, her voice soft and strained, "I've just received some troubling news from our corporate office. They've informed me that your reservation issue has triggered an immediate audit of the airline's operations." Jordan didn't respond right away. He let her words hang in the air, the weight of them settling in. The flight attendant was visibly uncomfortable, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation now that the company's executives had gotten involved. I just wanted to say that we're doing everything we can to resolve this," she stammered. "And we're extremely sorry for the inconvenience you've faced today." Jordan's lips curved into a small smile, but his eyes remained cold. "You're doing everything you can, huh?" he said quietly. "I'm not sure that's enough anymore." The flight attendant swallowed, her throat dry as she realized what was happening. She had no idea that her actions had set off a chain of events that was now out of her control. Jordan had pulled strings, made calls, and set in motion a situation that would cost the airline more than just an apology. It would cost them credibility. The audit wasn't just about the flight. It was about an investigation into how they handled customer service, and it would now be attached to their reputation. She could see it in his eyes. The final blow was coming. "You see," Jordan continued, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight, "it's not just about the seat anymore. You've disrespected me, and now you're going to pay the price, not just you, your whole company." The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment, her face flushing with the realization of what Jordan had done. The disruption on the flight, the delays, the complaints, it had all been orchestrated. It was no longer just a minor inconvenience for her. It was the beginning of a much bigger storm. She realized she had just witnessed a lesson in power and influence, and it was something she would never forget. Jordan, on the other hand, simply sat back and watched it unfold. The real satisfaction wasn't in the apology or the disruption. It was knowing that he had just turned the tables entirely. He wasn't the one who would suffer. This time, it was the airline and its staff who would bear the consequences of their own arrogance. Jordan knew that by the time they landed in Los Angeles, things would be very different. The flight attendants would never look at another passenger the same way again, and the airline would have a long, hard road ahead of them to recover from this debacle. And all of it had started with a simple, calculated decision, one that had taught everyone on that plane the price of underestimating the wrong person. The remaining hours of the flight passed in an eerie, almost uncomfortable silence. The crew tried their best to resume normal service, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. The passengers, once oblivious to the disturbance, began to sense that something more was going on. The flight attendants, usually so confident and in control, were now visibly uneasy, their interactions with passengers more strained than ever. Jordan, on the other hand, sat in his seat with a quiet satisfaction. His phone remained in his hand, and he occasionally glanced at the screen as his team continued to work behind the scenes. The flight attendants, no longer the confident figures they had been when the flight began, were scattered around the cabin, trying to manage a crisis they had no control over. As the minutes stretched on, Jordan could feel the weight of the fallout settling in. This wasn't just about the humiliation they'd caused him. It was about the damage they had unknowingly invited with their actions. By the time the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the head flight attendant had become almost frantic. She had made several calls during the flight, trying to mitigate the damage and smooth things over with her superiors. But there was no escaping what had already been set in motion. Jordan had quietly ensured that the corporate executives at the airline were well aware of the situation, and now they were scrambling to address the aftermath of his subtle but powerful interference. As the seatbelt sign flickered on and the plane began its final approach, the tension was at a breaking point. The head flight attendant walked up the aisle once again, her face pale and her posture stiff. She paused at Jordan's seat, a nervous smile barely crossing her lips. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, trying to keep her voice steady, "we'll be landing shortly, and I just wanted to assure you that we're taking this matter very seriously. The airline's corporate office will be in touch with you directly after we land. We are deeply sorry for the inconvenience, and will make sure this is handled appropriately." Jordan didn't look at her as she spoke. He simply nodded, letting her words wash over him. He wasn't interested in apologies anymore. He had already achieved what he wanted. The seeds of doubt had been planted. The airline would now have to deal with the repercussions of a customer service disaster that no apology could fix. His influence had made sure of that. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the cabin erupted in the usual chatter and movement, but it was clear that the crew was exhausted. The young flight attendant, who had been the most dismissive, now looked defeated, her eyes downcast as she gathered the final bits of paperwork. Jordan watched them all, his gaze unwavering. The wheels of the airplane had barely come to a stop when he felt his phone buzz again. Another update. The first message was brief. "Audit is confirmed. Full investigation underway. All staff involved have been flagged for review." Jordan leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the knowledge that the situation had fully spiraled into a crisis. The corporate office, now fully aware of the extent of the disruption, would have no choice but to act. The flight attendants would face the consequences of their mistake, and the airline itself would have to deal with the fallout of their poor handling of the situation. There was no escaping the damage now. As passengers began to disembark, Jordan stood up, grabbing his bag and preparing to exit the plane. The head flight attendant was there at the door, still trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism, but her efforts were futile. She could barely look him in the eye. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Maxwell," she said, her voice quieter than before. Jordan paused for a moment, just long enough to make sure she understood the weight of what he was saying. "I hope you've learned something today," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge. "Respect goes both ways. Remember that next time." With that, he walked past her, leaving her standing there, unable to do anything but watch him leave. The plane had landed, but for her and the rest of the crew, the real journey was just beginning. Their careers, their reputations, and their future with the airline would never be the same. Jordan stepped out into the terminal, his mind already on the next step of his day, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about showing that actions had consequences. Sometimes, the smallest gesture could make the biggest difference, and today, he had made sure the flight attendants learned that lesson the hard way. As he walked through the bustling terminal, Jordan knew that he had delivered a message loud and clear. They would never forget the day they crossed him. It didn't take long for the ripple effects of what had happened on that flight to reach the higher-ups at the airline. By the time Jordan's feet hit the tarmac in Los Angeles, the wheels of corporate bureaucracy were already in motion. The messages had been sent, the reports were filed, and an internal investigation had been launched. In the following days, the crew from that flight would find themselves caught in the crosshairs of their own mistakes. The young flight attendant who had caused the initial problem was suspended indefinitely. Her behavior had been flagged as a violation of customer service protocols, and she was now facing scrutiny from both her superiors and the airline's legal team. The head flight attendant wasn't spared either. Though she wasn't suspended, she was immediately reassigned to a different route and warned about her handling of the situation. It was clear the airline wasn't taking any chances. For Jordan, this was just another day in the life of a man who knew how to wield power. He didn't need to make public accusations or take out full-page ads in the newspapers to get his point across. All it took was one phone call, one small act of influence, and a small team of his trusted people to set everything in motion. He had made sure that the airline's reputation would be on the line for a long time to come. Meanwhile, the corporate office at the airline was scrambling to contain the damage. They had no idea who Jordan Maxwell truly was until the internal reports started coming in. It wasn't until they reviewed the audit files and discovered his influence in the airline industry that they realized the full extent of the mistake they had made. A billionaire with connections to multiple aviation companies, Jordan had the kind of reach that could bring even the largest corporations to their knees if he chose to use it, and use it he had. The next time the airline's leadership met for a strategic meeting, the name Jordan Maxwell was brought up more than once. The executive team spent hours discussing how to repair the damage done, but the truth was that they were playing catch-up. The incident on that flight had exposed the cracks in their customer service protocols, and now they were trying to figure out how to recover from a black eye they hadn't expected. Jordan's involvement wasn't just a passing inconvenience, it was a wake-up call. The airline had treated a powerful man like a regular passenger, and now they were paying the price for it. They quickly realized that in a world where customer service could make or break a company, they had dropped the ball with someone who had the means to hold them accountable. For the passengers who had been on that flight, the story of what happened was quickly becoming one of the most talked about moments of their travels. Some saw it as a case of corporate overreach, a tale of a rich man flexing his muscles over an insignificant mistake. Others saw it as a story of justice being served, a reminder that no one, no matter how high up, should be treated with disrespect. Regardless of where they stood on the matter, one thing was clear: the incident had left an impression. Jordan Maxwell had turned what could have been a small inconvenience into a lesson for everyone involved. Back in Los Angeles, Jordan had moved on to more important matters: his meetings, his business ventures, and his numerous other interests. But he couldn't help but think about the events that had unfolded on the flight. The sense of satisfaction still lingered, but there was also a lesson in it for him. Power wasn't just about the ability to make things happen. It was about knowing when to act, when to let the situation play out, and when to deliver a final blow that would make sure the lesson stuck. As he sat in his office, reviewing some contracts for his next big deal, Jordan couldn't help but smile as he thought about the flight attendants. They were probably still reeling from what had happened, trying to pick up the pieces of their disrupted careers. But that was the cost of arrogance, the price of not recognizing who you were dealing with when you had the chance. He picked up his phone and made another call, but this time it was to his lawyer. The conversation was brief, businesslike. The airline had already contacted him with a settlement offer, something to make the situation go away quietly. But Jordan wasn't interested in the settlement. This wasn't about money. It was about respect. They had disrespected him, and now they had to live with the consequences. Jordan ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. He had made his point, and in this world, where power and influence were everything, that was enough. The airline would rebuild, the flight attendants would move on, but Jordan Maxwell would remain a reminder that respect was something not to be taken for granted. In this world, no one, no matter how big or small, could afford to forget that. The aftermath of the incident with Jordan Maxwell had far-reaching effects that went beyond what anyone could have anticipated. While the airline scrambled to contain the situation and repair the damage to its public image, there were deeper, more long-lasting consequences that weren't immediately visible to the outside world. The first sign of trouble came from within the airline's own ranks. Employees, especially those in customer service and frontline operations, began to feel the ripple effects of the incident. There was a shift in the atmosphere at the company. What had been a confident, fast-moving corporation was now a much more cautious entity, second-guessing every decision and every action. The corporate culture had been shaken, and it wasn't just about bad press. The company had been forced to confront its own weaknesses, its failure to truly understand the power dynamics of their clientele, especially in an era where reputations could be tarnished in an instant by a single well-placed move. In the weeks that followed, Jordan's name continued to make rounds within the company, though not in the way they had hoped. His quiet but effective manipulation of the situation had created a ripple effect that wouldn't go away quickly. The airline's CEO, once so proud of the company's unshakable reputation, began receiving calls from partners, stakeholders, and investors who were suddenly questioning the airline's ability to handle customer relationships. The incident had shown just how easily things could go wrong, and no one wanted to be associated with a company that had made such a high-profile mistake. Behind the scenes, the airline's internal audits didn't just focus on customer service, but also extended to its hiring and training practices. The young flight attendant who had initially asked Jordan to move had been the catalyst, but the investigation soon revealed a much larger issue with how the airline handled sensitive situations. The airline had been cutting corners in its training programs, focusing more on efficiency than empathy, and it was clear that some employees, especially those in customer-facing roles, lacked the understanding of how to handle powerful or influential passengers. The staff who had been involved in the flight's disruption were now facing more scrutiny than they had ever imagined. The younger flight attendant, still reeling from the consequences of her actions, was called into a series of meetings with HR and upper management. Though she had been suspended, it wasn't just her behavior that was being questioned. It was the company's entire approach to training its employees. Many began to wonder how many other incidents like this might have been brushed aside or overlooked. In an industry as competitive as air travel, where the slightest misstep could cause irreparable damage, the fallout from this event would resonate for months. Other airlines and competitors took notice. and some even quietly expressed interest in Jordan's influence, hoping to learn how to avoid making the same mistake. The industry's elite were starting to see just how powerful one disgruntled passenger could be when they knew how to use their power strategically. For Jordan, however, these broader consequences were nothing more than a footnote. He didn't dwell on the fallout. It was, after all, simply the price others had to pay for their disrespect. What mattered to him was that he had restored a sense of order in his world, where people were beginning to realize that their actions had a real cost. His influence had been the force behind it, and that was all that mattered. What was more interesting to Jordan was the way people now viewed him. He had always been seen as a wealthy and powerful man, but this situation had solidified his reputation in a way that even his vast wealth had not. People began to see him not just as a businessman, but as someone who could change the course of events with a single decision. The airline had made a mistake in underestimating him, and the entire industry had learned that lesson the hard way. The truth was, Jordan didn't need to exert power every day to feel in control. The situation with the airline had been a moment of correction, a subtle reminder that respect wasn't something to be taken for granted, no matter how much money or influence you had. And in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that the lessons learned were the right ones. As for the flight attendants, they would have to live with the consequences of their actions for a long time to come. The young attendant would likely never forget the way Jordan had made her feel small, not just in that moment on the plane, but in the way her career had unraveled as a result. The head flight attendant, too, would bear the weight of this experience in a different way. Both would go on with their lives, but the lesson would stay with them for much longer than the inconvenience of the flight itself. And so, the unseen consequences of that flight rippled outward, touching everything from corporate policies to employee training. The world of high-powered executives and wealthy passengers was one that required constant care and respect. Jordan Maxwell had made that lesson abundantly clear, and the consequences of that would echo through the industry for a long time. Months passed after the incident, and the chaos that had unfolded on that fateful flight slowly faded from the headlines. The airline, having taken some serious hits to its reputation, had managed to steady the ship, at least on the surface. The employees involved in the disruption, including the flight attendants, had either been reassigned, suspended, or, in the case of the younger attendant, quietly let go. The internal investigation had led to new customer service protocols, stricter training programs, and a significant overhaul in how the company would handle future complaints and conflicts. But for Jordan Maxwell, life continued as it always had. He didn't gloat about his victory or make public statements about what had transpired. He wasn't one for drawing attention to himself unless he absolutely needed to. The satisfaction he felt from the incident wasn't in the aftermath. It was in the knowledge that he had made an impact, one that wouldn't soon be forgotten. He had done what he set out to do, and now the consequences were playing out without him having to lift another finger. The airline had learned a lesson, and Jordan knew they wouldn't be making the same mistake again. He didn't need to keep reminding them of the price they paid. In a way, he had silently walked away, content with the quiet resolution of the matter. The young flight attendant who had been so quick to dismiss him was, by now, working at a much smaller airline. She had learned the hard way that being in the service industry wasn't just about following protocols. It was about understanding the people you were serving, no matter how much power or influence they seemed to have. Her new job was far less glamorous, and she had been forced to start over in a way that few would ever have anticipated. She would no longer look at any passenger as just another face in the crowd. Meanwhile, the head flight attendant had been reassigned to a different role, far from the front lines. Her career, once on a fast track toward promotion, had been derailed by a single encounter with a man who knew how to make his voice heard. Though she remained with the airline, her standing within the company was no longer what it had been. She had been a symbol of authority, but now, her name was one whispered behind closed doors, remembered for the day she mishandled one of the most powerful men in the aviation industry. In the corporate offices of the airline, Life had returned to a sense of normalcy, but the shadow of the incident still loomed over them. The CEO and senior executives knew they had dodged a bullet. Their immediate response to the audit had saved them from an even larger crisis. But they knew the story of Jordan Maxwell would be etched in their minds for years to come. He had made it clear, underestimating anyone, no matter how rich or unknown, was a mistake they couldn't afford to repeat. It wasn't just about the customer's satisfaction anymore. It was about understanding who you were dealing with and respecting that. For Jordan, the quiet resolution of the matter was the perfect ending. The ripple effect of his actions had changed the way people in the industry viewed customer service, and he hadn't had to make a single public statement about it. The message had been delivered in the most efficient way possible, through action, not words. He had used his position not to crush his enemies, but to teach them the price of arrogance. And that, he knew, was the most powerful lesson of all. In his world, power wasn't just about being the loudest in the room or the richest in the boardroom. It was about knowing when to act, when to let things play out, and when to walk away, leaving behind a lasting impression without needing to utter another word. As Jordan Maxwell continued on with his business, meetings, and daily life, the lessons from that flight faded into the background, but they were still there. They would always be there. His actions had set a precedent not just for the airline, but for anyone who might ever cross him again. The world had learned that disrespect wasn't something Jordan would tolerate, and now they all knew what it cost to make that mistake. The airline would move on, of course, but Jordan would always carry the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, in that moment, he had taught them a lesson that would echo for a long time to come. Though Jordan Maxwell had largely moved on from the incident, the world he had left behind wasn't as easily shaken. The echoes of that flight continued to reverberate, particularly in the small but increasingly influential circles that dealt with high-net-worth individuals and corporate affairs. While most people had forgotten the specifics of the disruption, those who knew the real story whispered about it behind closed doors, discussing the powerful lesson Jordan had imparted with a single calculated action. And not all of those whispers were positive. The airline's executives, despite their best efforts to move on, knew the damage hadn't truly been undone. They had managed to clean up the mess in public, but the undercurrents of resentment and the tarnished reputation still lingered in the private corridors of corporate offices. Their scramble to fix the problem had revealed cracks in the company's otherwise polished facade. More than a few high-level meetings had been dedicated to damage control, as top executives privately worried that Jordan's influence might extend beyond this one incident. There was a quiet unease in the way they now approached their high-profile customers, wondering if, perhaps, they had missed something important, something that could cause their business more harm down the road. For the flight attendants involved, particularly the young one who had made the initial mistake, the psychological toll wasn't something that could be easily fixed. The suspension had been a heavy blow to her confidence, but the real damage had been to her sense of security. She was now fully aware that a single, careless mistake in the service industry could lead to her entire career unraveling. Though she had tried to put the incident behind her, she couldn't escape the whispers. In every new job, in every new role, she found herself subtly judged by the people who hired her. They didn't need to know the details of her past. All they had to do was look at her history, and it was clear that she had been involved in a high-profile incident that had rocked one of the largest airlines in the world. No matter how much she tried to prove herself, she couldn't shake the knowledge that people in the industry knew her name for the wrong reasons. It made her question every decision she made, every smile she forced, every service interaction that she had with passengers. She had once been confident and proud of her role, but now there was a constant, nagging fear that her reputation would precede her wherever she went. No amount of training could erase the feeling of being watched. As for the head flight attendant, her demotion to a more mundane role within the company was also a source of constant personal frustration. She had once believed she was on the fast track to a high-level managerial position, but that dream had been shattered by a simple mistake. She was still with the airline, but her spirit had been broken. The constant reminders from her superiors about her slip-up haunted her, Every meeting, every new assignment, carried with it the weight of that one flight. Her co-workers noticed the shift in her demeanor too. She was no longer the sharp, confident leader they once admired. Now she was more withdrawn, a shadow of the person she used to be, and no one knew how to approach her anymore. They could all sense that she was carrying something heavy inside. The airline, too, couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. In the coming months, corporate surveys and customer feedback began to show a slight but noticeable dip in satisfaction ratings. The passengers who had flown with them in the aftermath of the incident felt a subtle difference. They weren't as quick to forgive the company for what had occurred, even if they didn't fully understand the details. Trust had been eroded, and despite the airline's efforts to restore confidence, it was clear that Jordan's intervention had left a lasting mark on how people viewed their brand. The executives at the airline soon realized that their recovery efforts weren't going to be as easy as they'd hoped. Despite the public-facing moves to smooth over the incident, behind the scenes, there were still murmurs of dissatisfaction. They could throw money at the problem with advertising campaigns, training seminars, and public apologies, but nothing would truly repair the damage done to their internal culture. Trust, once broken, was not so easily mended, especially when powerful figures like Jordan Maxwell were watching from the sidelines. Jordan's quiet strategy of influence had worked exactly as he intended. He hadn't forced the airline to fold or topple in a dramatic fashion, nor had he taken over their operations or publicly humiliated them further. Instead, he had let them implode slowly from within, watching as cracks began to form in their once impenetrable armor. While they pretended everything was fine, behind closed doors they knew the truth. Jordan Maxwell's actions had exposed their weaknesses, and they couldn't undo the damage in a simple boardroom meeting or by throwing money at the problem. And so, as the months passed, Jordan remained largely out of the spotlight, continuing his business dealings and quietly enjoying his life, knowing full well that the lessons he'd taught had settled into the corporate psyche. He had never needed to raise his voice or flaunt his power. In fact, it was the very silence of his actions that had made them all the more deadly. In a world where businesses crumbled beneath the weight of negative press, Jordan had shown that sometimes the most powerful weapon of all was simply letting the consequences unfold naturally. The real damage, the lasting damage, was not the immediate fallout. It was the lingering uncertainty, the quiet shift in how people viewed the airline and its employees. They couldn't undo the change that had been set in motion. What Jordan had done was subtle, calculated, and precise. And while the world moved on, the hidden tensions within the airline's walls continued to grow, waiting for the next mistake, the next disruption, or the next misstep to set it all into motion again. A full year had passed since the flight incident, and while life had seemingly returned to normal for the airline, it wasn't without its complications. The changes they had implemented, new training programs, a revamped customer service approach, had only managed to paper over the cracks. Beneath the polished surface, the airline was beginning to show signs of a deeper unraveling. The young flight attendant who had been involved in the initial confrontation, now working for a smaller regional airline, found herself facing more personal and professional struggles. Despite her efforts to rebuild her career, she could never fully escape the shadow of that incident. The whispers still followed her. The industry, though vast, was tightly knit, and no amount of time or effort could make the stain of failure vanish entirely. Her colleagues at her new job would occasionally mention the event, always with that uncomfortable look, the kind people get when they want to be sympathetic, but don't quite know how. And as time went on, it became clear that her reputation, despite her best efforts, was permanently tainted. More than once she overheard murmurs about the flight with the billionaire and how things had gone wrong. She tried to ignore it, to focus on doing her job and proving herself in her new role. But the feeling that she was being judged before she even had a chance to prove her worth lingered like a constant weight. The head flight attendant, though still employed by the airline, found herself increasingly isolated. She had been demoted after the incident, but the real punishment was the way her colleagues treated her. Once a rising star, she was now relegated to the quieter, less prestigious routes. Her relationships with her co-workers had become strained. No longer was she the confident, respected leader she once was. Instead, she was the subject of hushed conversations in break rooms, the reminder of a failure that cost more than just a few hours of inconvenience. It cost her career momentum, and possibly even her future at the company. Her new role was a far cry from the managerial position she had once been eyeing. She was now managing mundane operational details, far removed from the fast-paced, high-profile assignments she had once thrived on. And, despite her efforts to salvage her image, she found herself in meetings where her authority was questioned at every turn. The same executives who had once looked at her as a potential leader now seemed hesitant to trust her. Every decision she made was scrutinized. Every word she spoke met with hesitation. There was no escaping the shadow of the past. Her personal life was affected too. At social gatherings, colleagues from the airline would treat her with polite indifference, and the occasional raised eyebrow was enough to make her feel like an outsider. She had once held her head high with pride in her work, but now she couldn't help but feel as though everyone saw her through the lens of that one mistake. It was a quiet kind of isolation, one that no amount of corporate success could shield her from. Meanwhile, the airline itself was in turmoil. Their efforts to rebrand and repair their image had not been as successful as they'd hoped. Public satisfaction had improved somewhat, but behind the scenes, the damage to their internal operations was far worse than they anticipated. The incident with Jordan Maxwell had cracked open the company's most vulnerable aspects: its inability to handle power dynamics and its overconfidence in customer service protocols. Internally, the airline's management had become paranoid, often second-guessing their decisions. They had fallen into a constant state of defensive posturing, always waiting for the next crisis to erupt. The leadership team, once confident and forward-thinking, had become reactive, focusing more on damage control than on innovative growth. The board meetings, which were once filled with ambitious plans and visionary goals, had turned into sessions focused almost exclusively on managing their public image. In particular, the executives who had failed to recognize Jordan's influence were under increasing pressure. Their inability to properly handle the crisis had led to questions about their leadership and foresight. What had started as a small misstep, a single argument between a passenger and a flight attendant, had spiraled into a corporate crisis, shaking the very foundation of the airline. Now, executives who had once risen through the ranks on their sharp instincts and confident decision-making found themselves second-guessing every move they made. The airline's stock price, which had been on an upward trajectory prior to the incident, began to falter. Investors, once bullish on the airline's future, started to pull back, nervous about the long-term implications of the scandal. Wall Street analysts questioned the airline's ability to recover from the reputational damage, and the once stellar brand began to lose its shine in the eyes of the public. Jordan Maxwell had, without ever intending to, triggered a slow, painful unraveling. While he had moved on, his quiet but deliberate intervention had set off a chain of events that the airline would not recover from easily. The company, despite all its efforts to repair the damage, would forever carry the weight of that incident. Jordan didn't need to be involved anymore. His influence had done its job. The airline, like many corporations before it, had learned the hard way that disrespecting the wrong person could have consequences that went far beyond the immediate aftermath. For Jordan, this wasn't about vengeance. It was about making a point, and the point had been made. Now, as the airline faced its own internal struggle, Jordan's life continued with little disruption. He went about his business, quietly cementing his reputation as someone whose presence was not to be underestimated. For him, the incident was just another reminder of the quiet power he wielded. But for the airline, the true consequences were only beginning to unfold, ones that would reshape its future and the careers of those involved forever. Just when the airline thought it had weathered the worst of the storm, something unexpected happened. A quiet, behind-the-scenes issue began to snowball into something bigger, something no one had anticipated. It was a phone call, innocuous at first, that triggered a new wave of unrest among the airline's top executives. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, even soothing, but the words were chilling. A representative from one of the airline's major competitors had reached out to them, asking about the details of their recent adjustments to staff protocols. The wording was polite, but it was clear that their rival knew exactly what had happened behind the scenes. They knew about the internal audits, the retraining, and the quiet restructuring that had followed the disruption caused by Jordan Maxwell. What they didn't know, though, was just how deeply the incident had affected the airline's operations, or that it was far from over. This wasn't just an isolated incident anymore. The fallout from that flight had become a case study, discussed behind closed doors at every major airline board meeting. Jordan Maxwell had inadvertently turned a simple customer service failure into a textbook example of how not to handle high-profile passengers. The competitors had caught wind of this and were now making subtle but strategic moves, poaching valuable employees from the airline, hiring consultants to improve their own systems, and quietly positioning themselves as a safer bet in the eyes of the public. The executives at the airline realized that they were now facing a new kind of problem. They were no longer just repairing their internal operations. They were actively losing ground to a competitor that was now taking advantage of their weaknesses. Jordan's quiet influence had destabilized their position, and the longer they ignored the underlying issues, the more vulnerable they became to a competitive takeover. In the midst of all this, the airline's CEO, who had once been confident that the situation would resolve itself with time, began to panic. The stock price had dipped again, this time with renewed intensity. Analysts were once again raising questions about the airline's future, citing internal unrest and a lack of clear direction. The public perception, which had seemed to improve, had shifted once more. The subtle yet powerful undercurrent of the Jordan Maxwell incident was still lingering, and it was now infecting every corner of the business. This wasn't just about the flight anymore. The way the airline had handled their relationship with a powerful passenger had opened up deeper, systemic flaws in their approach to customer service, and now their competitors were capitalizing on it. Jordan had achieved what no one could have predicted. He hadn't just caused a temporary disruption, he had sparked a chain of events that would change the airline's course for good. His actions had made the airline vulnerable, exposed their weaknesses, and set them up for an unexpected fall. The executives, now realizing how deep the damage ran, had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. The incident wasn't over. It had merely evolved into something far more insidious. They had been underestimating the long-term effects of their failure to properly handle a single powerful individual. They had thought it was a one-off mistake, a mere inconvenience to brush off. But they were wrong. For the first time, the airline's leadership was forced to face the full weight of their error. The situation was no longer about patching up the public image. It was about a long-term strategic shift, one that involved regaining lost ground, securing their future, and addressing the systemic issues that had been exposed. They had underestimated Jordan Maxwell, and now they were paying the price. The turning point had arrived, and the question that loomed over the company now was simple. Could they recover, or had they already lost the game? By the time the airline's executives sat down for their next board meeting, the realization had fully settled in. They were at a crossroads. What had begun as a public relations disaster was now a deep-seated issue threatening the very foundation of the company. Their competitor had gained momentum, the stock price had plummeted further, and the trust they had spent decades building was eroding faster than they could repair it. Jordan Maxwell, from his position of quiet influence, had walked away from the situation. He wasn't involved in the ongoing fallout, nor did he need to be. His lesson had been delivered, his point made. The company, and the people within it, would continue to pay the price for their failure to recognize the importance of respect and understanding in every interaction. But for Jordan, the satisfaction was never in the destruction. It was in the long-term impact of his actions. In a world where money and power often spoke louder than principles, he had proven that sometimes it wasn't about using those things aggressively. It was about using them with precision. The airline had learned that the hard way. They had learned that power, influence, and respect were forces to be reckoned with, forces that couldn't be dismissed with a polite smile or a temporary fix. The airline's leadership would struggle for years to come, trying to repair the damage Jordan had set in motion. They would attempt to re-establish their standing, rebuild trust with passengers, and reclaim their position in the market. But the memory of that fateful flight would always be there, lingering in the background, a constant reminder of how easily a single person could disrupt their world. For the flight attendants, the lesson was personal. The young attendant, now working at a smaller airline, would always remember that one decision that had cost her more than just a seat on a plane. The head flight attendant, too, would carry the weight of that mistake throughout her career, knowing that her once promising path had been derailed by a simple, yet profound failure to respect the power of those they served. And Jordan Maxwell, as always, would continue to move through the world with his quiet confidence, a man who knew how to get what he wanted without ever raising his voice. He had taught the airline, and the world, a lesson that would echo far beyond the confines of that one flight. Respect was not just about politeness, it was about recognizing who you were dealing with, understanding the consequences of your actions, and knowing that every choice you made had a lasting impact. In the end, Jordan didn't need revenge. He needed only to teach the world a simple but powerful lesson. Never underestimate anyone, because the consequences could be far greater than you ever imagined.